Okay, after a couple days and a few TV specials later, let's continue on with these videos. I only have one book to talk about today. This is Loyalty, the Vexing Virtue by Eric Felton. And this honestly is a whole book just on the topic of loyalty as a concept, as a virtue. Someone dinging me to message them back. Yeah, just as a personality trait, or, the importance of it in various aspects of life. Basically just whatever you could think of on the topic, it covers it in this book, at least a little bit. It's an interesting read. It's pretty informal. It's mostly stories, for the most part, of just examples throughout literature. He tackles examples in history, in world literature, in law enforcement and military examples, how loyalty comes into play in those environments. Eric Felton himself, the author, is a prize-winning journalist for the Wall Street Journal, or again, at least he was at the time of the publishing, which this particular one was brought out in, what was it? 2011. So yeah, if you're curious if they are still with these publications, you can always look that up, I guess. With world history, a lot of the emphasis in this book is going to be on Greek history and Greek mythology, Greek tragedy, because if you want to talk about loyalty, where else to go but Greek plays and Greek mythology comes up a lot. The other one he mentions that is a big hitter, obviously, is later on when he talks about literature. Dogs are doing something weird on the other side of the door. When he talks about literature, he naturally goes to the big hitter, Shakespeare, because I don't know, maybe Shakespeare, out of really anybody in literary history, tackles the topic of loyalty the most. I mean, we have the whole term Shakespearean tragedy, which is usually focused around somebody being disloyal or somebody discovering their loyalty is challenged, or being wronged by somebody. All those themes play big in his dramatic pieces. So Shakespeare is brought up a lot in this as well. I will mention, I think I made a list of them in the written review I did. There are quite a few spoilers for other books as far as classic novels. When I'm doing reviews, if I come across spoilers, I try to write them out so that people, when they're reading reviews, they know going in, before they're spoiled, that it's going to come up. So if you're working your way through various classics lists or something like that, and you're curious about this book, my review will be linked below if you want to double check the list about which books get spoiled. Just as an example, as far as Greek tragedies, Antigone and Agamemnon, Ovid's Metamorphoses, in other classic literature, George Orwell's Animal Farm, King Henry V, 1001 Arabian Nights, Huck Finn. Those are just a few of the ones that I remember spoilers being mentioned. But literature, one of the stories I wanted to bring up was, there's a good bit in here where he talks about the story behind, the true life story behind Graham Greene, who is now known for classics like The Quiet American and The End of the Affair. And he's pretty established for the most part. I would say he kind of falls under like a modern classic. He's not classic as far as like Charles Dickens or something that far back, but more modern classic, I guess. But there's a discussion in here about his younger days and his struggles with depression early on. I'm talking about like his teen years. And he was in this situation where, when he was younger, where he was struggling with where to place his loyalty as a child, because his father, turns out, was the headmaster for the school where Graham Greene attended, and Graham Greene had a lot of friends there, and he was always struggling about whether to follow the expectations of his family, feelings of loyalty towards his family, and especially his father, since his father was not only his father, but also sort of his boss at the school. So he struggled with that versus his feelings of loyalty, as kids naturally do, towards their friends. And he didn't know which way to go. He didn't want to hurt anybody, and the pressure of that really started to build on him until he got, I think, in his late teens maybe, where the depression and everything got too much, and he got to a point where he felt like suicide was the most viable option to end this pain. And since he's an established writer now, we know now that he eventually got over that hump and got to where he made sense of things and was able to go on with his life. But and he went on to find great success and happiness for the most part down the road. But one of the things they talk about in here is that in his adult years, at least outwardly, he liked to be very outspoken about his belief now that that loyalty was not as important, or whenever he was asked to give talks or speeches or anything like that, he always sort of publicly denounced the concept of loyalty, saying it was just, this sort of warm fuzzy idea that people were raised with, but that it doesn't play that importantly into everyday life and shouldn't put that much weight into it, and all of these things. But Felton goes back into some of Green's work and pulls out excerpts where it kind of hints that maybe that was just Graham's outward bravado about maybe inner pain, because his works seem to show evidence that he actually did believe in loyalty still, at least on some level. So literature is discussed. Oh, business. Maybe that was the one I was trying to think of earlier, the area he talked about. Felton talks about business and how loyalty plays into business, as far as loyalty programs that companies develop, how companies develop these loyalty programs to suck you in as a customer and keep you there. The psychology behind how they're developed and why they work, and also brand loyalty. I'm sure everybody knows somebody that has a certain loyalty to specific brands, at least one brand that they really love. And this talks about the psychology behind that. Why do we develop loyalty towards brands? Is it the name, or is it specifically quality all of the time? Or what are the factors that make us say this is better than anything else? And he kind of plays that against how that compares to loyalty to a person. How do we decide to have stronger loyalty towards one person or one party than another? And of course, that concept also plays into the idea of politics, which can be very appropriate to today's reading. Today, generally speaking, not today, but in today's world, there is a lot of division in political parties. So he looks at that and just the psychology behind the concept of loyalty in general. And like I mentioned, military and law enforcement, he talks about how how loyalty and the idea of it is used to build strength in troops within the military, and how codes of conduct are developed and why they're so enforced. The law enforcement thing, a lot of it he brings up around like prison system life, and how loyalty plays an importance there. He even has a section where he talks about loyalty within the entertainment industry, as far as like stories about people being blacklisted, or loyalty within contracts, industry contracts, even celebrity relationships. One of the ones he talks about specifically in here is the sort of break apart of the relationship between Sandra Bullock and Jesse James, when that whole thing blew up, where I think it was right after she won her Oscar, that, curse of the Oscar, that like they talk about, that whenever a woman earns an Oscar, there's a sort of a myth that her relationship tends to implode after that. Well, I think that's about the time that went down where, if you didn't hear about it or don't remember, there was a whole big thing about how, at the time, Sandra Bullock very publicly supported her husband and talked about how much she was in love with him, and then it came out that he had been cheating on her for a while with really dirty looking women, if we're going to be honest about it. You scratched your head thinking, what? Really? That's, it's like my husband and I always joke, if you're going to cheat, at least cheat up. Make me feel a little bit better about it, so I can say, well, I can see why you went for that, but no, don't ever cheat down. And he cheated down hard, repeatedly, and publicly. And so Felton uses that whole relationship and its demise in the topic of loyalty here. So the whole idea of this really is to look at, why do we put so much stock in this concept even now, when we know it's so risky to invest our hearts and our time into people that could eventually turn on us or use us, or it has potential to seriously blow up in our face. So why do we put so much stock in loyalty? Well, in his book, Felton poses his belief that it is still a worthwhile endeavor to build loyalty towards people and invest in relationships. And he mentions, again, the psychology behind it. When you have people behind you that are loyal to you, that have your back, honestly, without ulterior motive or ill intent, you just overall live a better life. You feel better about yourself when you feel like you have people behind you that support you. You tend to take more risks. You tend to go on more adventures. You tend to pursue more dreams because you feel like you have a system of support behind you where people are going to be honestly excited for you. So all these great things overall tend to come to you and to them, probably, because I would imagine it's reciprocated. Just it works out for everybody when it's in a healthy place. But Felton also gets into the sort of darker side of loyalty, when you give your loyalty to somebody and it's not when the person you're giving it to or the party you're giving it to is not the best recipient for it. If they do have ill intent, or if they do take you for granted. Not to get dark, but one of the examples he uses is the example of Hitler. Because, when you talk about loyalty turned wrong, Hitler convinced a lot of people to follow his lead and go his way. And look how devastating that turned when he turned it around and said, ha ha, you fell for it. So that's sort of where the vexing thing comes in. You want to have faith in people, but there is this vexing nature, as Felton puts it, where it can blow up in your face. So there's a lot of light philosophy, sociology, psychology brought into this, but it makes for an entertaining read. It doesn't get super heavy. They're just little stories here, almost like an essay collection in a way, because there's a different topic for each chapter. So you can read it in little bits and not be overwhelmed. But it also, reading this also kind of had me thinking about how loyalty works, even with the environment of YouTube. Like I said, when you place your loyalty with someone that doesn't necessarily deserve it, that had me thinking about YouTube a lot, because how many people do we see that happens to? These channels that develop audiences that they're not necessarily deserving of. I don't want to get into names, but the scandals that came up recently with certain YouTubers who did illegal and kind of despicable things on camera, and yet their they had a good portion of their audiences stick with them, stand behind them, even make excuses for them and say, oh, well, they're misunderstood. They're going through a rough time right now. And I don't need to speak about anybody specifically, because I'm sure anyone watching this can think of at least one YouTuber who falls under that title, bigger YouTuber that falls under that title, because there's several of them who get into this sort of swirl where they become bigger than themselves, and they get caught up in the ego, and they get caught up in the feeding frenzy of people giving them affection and attention, and they start realizing they can get away with almost anything and people will forgive them and all of this. And it, I don't know, like that concept of loyalty, it got me thinking about this environment in YouTube, where you just, it has you wondering, where is the line? You know, the things that people get away with. And it's not, and this could be applied to so many areas now. I mean, with celebrities, with politicians, with our president now, with YouTube, anything. Like, there's so many places where you can ask yourself this question of, where is the dividing line? Where's the drawing line where we put, okay, that's too much, I have to sever my loyalty? Because as a viewer of human nature, because that is one thing about me. In person, I'm not super chatty in person. I've always been sort of the quiet one in the circle. I do a lot of people observations. That's just always been the way I've been wired. And being the type of person that observes people all the time, I just start noticing, I feel like people, do they even have a line anymore where you can say, absolutely, I'm done, I'm cutting my loyalties? You know, it seems like everybody wants to at least outwardly be perceived as the nice guy, and everybody gets a ribbon, and everybody's trying, everybody's going through a hard time. Like, it seems like people are scared to say, no, that is a terrible person over there, we need to walk away. Everybody is giving people more and more second, third, 26th chances. And I don't know, it had me thinking, like, where is the line? And this is coming from a person who, I have very definite lines within myself that I hold people to, where I do have a place for forgiveness in me, but I'm also the type of person that if I give you my, because I don't give out my trust very easily with people. I will give out my decency, like, you know, being decent to people, being polite to people, being kind to people. I will give all that freely, but as far as like my actual trust, where I honestly trust you with things within myself and about myself, I don't give that part of me out very lightly. And when I do, and it gets taken advantage of, or it gets thrown back in my face, I'm the type of person, you know, maybe it's the redhead in me, where I don't have a problem cutting you off, where I'm like, nope, we're good, we're done. No, and it's actually harder for me to get to that point of hearing you out again. You know, it's kind of like, what is it, the line from Pride and Prejudice? My good opinion once lost is lost forever. It's a lot of times I feel that way. It's because I get so hurt, because once I get to that point where I feel like I can trust somebody, I do it very tentatively, very scaredly, but I put myself out there so much. And, you know, I'm one of those people that's like, I will do it very quietly, but I put a lot of myself into somebody once I trust them. And when it gets thrown back in my face, I take it very personally, and it hurts very deeply. I hold on to it for a long time, which I know is not maybe the healthiest way to go about things, but again, it's the way I'm wired. It's something I have to work with all the time. But it's just, you know, for being a little book, it got me thinking about things. I thought, you know, I would maybe bring it up and have you guys thinking about things, and ask viewers, how important is loyalty to you in your relationships? You know, what are some of your personal parameters that you use where you know, I can't come back from this relationship, this friendship, whatever. It can't come back from this. Is it something really small? You know, you can admit it if you have a little petty side to you like I do. I admit it. I can be a petty bitch sometimes because I've been stung a lot by people, and that also plays into me being very careful with giving out my trust now, because I think I was very, shouldn't say I was very, I tried really hard when I was younger to put myself out there, even though I feel like I've always had this sense of, even though, I don't know, as far back as I can remember, I feel like I've always had this sense of, I don't know if it's always been distrust, but there's always been at least an element of caution in me around other people. I've always felt, I always had a problem growing up when you had people that older people, like when I was a kid and you had adults that would tell you, oh, you should trust this person just because they're an adult. Even as a child, I had this thing in my mind that was like, but I don't know them. We don't have an established relationship. I don't know that I can trust them just because they're a few decades older than me. That doesn't mean anything to me. But people insisted when I was a kid that, oh no, just because they're an adult, you need to trust them. And it always got me in trouble because I could also be really stubborn. Even to this day, I am still really stubborn because even as a little kid, I was very in tune with my instincts. And if I got around people where I said, no, I'm not comfortable with this person, I had no problem, even though I didn't talk a lot as a kid. If it came to that, I had no problem saying, I do not trust that person. I will not trust that person. I will not be in this situation anymore. I am leaving. I am walking out. And it used to frustrate the crap out of adults because, whether it was my relatives or my teachers or something, they would be like, no, you can't just remove yourself from the situation. You have to do what we say. And as a little kid, I'd be that one that's like, screw that. I don't know this person. And I would constantly have people trying to tell me, you can't go through life like that. And I'll tell you right now, I still go through life like that. I will still walk out of situations saying, even if I can't explain why, sometimes it's like, I barely met the person. And every once in a while I get somebody where I just hit a wall of energy or something with them where I'm like, they can't be trusted. And I will be like, okay, well, I have to separate myself now. And I still get people that are like, Angie, you can't be like that with people. And I'm like, if I get immediate discomfort from somebody as soon as they walk in, that's enough. I can't get around that. So I was just curious if you had certain parameters you watch for, if there are certain red flags where you've just hit a wall and you can't give anybody any more chances, or or if you just down below, if you want to share bitch out sessions down below about people who did you wrong and you want to rant about it, feel free to do that too. Before we end this little topic, there were a few excerpts I thought I would share that are kind of tied into some of the political environment that's going on now. The section that Felton talks about loyalty playing into world history. And one of the things that keeps me interested in history so much, it's not just the stories, although that is a large part of the drive, is just hearing stories of our ancestors and all of that. But another large part of it is just the concept behind the idea of that those who do not learn or remember history are doomed to repeat it. And so I'm always driven to keep educating myself, keep reading history, nonfiction history, to learn these stories, remember these stories, share them with you guys, with other people, so they know about it, get them interested in it, and hopefully, at least in some small way, do my part to help not repeat it. So whenever I come across little sections in books of history where things are mentioned that start to sound like things that are going on now or recently, I like to bring it up in videos so that we have some record of, hey guys, it seems like we're doing this again. So in that idea, there is a section in here that I thought I would go over where Felton talks about loyalty as it came up during the World Wars, and how it was kind of turned in a painful way to a lot of people that didn't necessarily need it turned it into their direction. So starting in World War I, he talks about how Americans were sort of turned against German Americans by our politics, similar to the way it was done in World War II with Japanese Americans acting like they were the source of the problem and where we needed to direct our hate. Prior to that, something similar happened with our government towards the German Americans. So Felton writes, even where there is some identifiable sabotage and sedition, efforts to stamp it out have a tendency to get ugly or worse. Once the United States had entered World War I, Woodrow Wilson, it's hard to say after World War I to go into Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's campaign to demand unambiguous loyalty of German Americans quickly devolved into a frenzy of anti-squarehead bigotry. German Americans made frantic and loud declarations of fidelity, but the flag kissing wasn't enough to stop official government assault on German language newspapers, music, unions made up predominantly of German American workers, and even beer. The Temperance Union had been trying for decades to impose a national prohibition on alcohol. Its main organized opposition was made up of the beer barons, who had used their deep pockets and the political clout of German American organizations around the country to blunt their prohibition assault. Those barons had inconvenient names such as Pabst, Schlitz, Blotz, and Busch, and the teetotalers took aim. When the United States finally entered the war, old Adolphus Busch, man, some of these people got hard names for me. Old Adolphus Busch's widow, I'll get through it, just happened to be in Germany visiting their daughters who had married Teutonic aristocrats. Pointing to her residence in enemy territory, the temperance types moved to have the assets of Anheuser-Busch seized as alien property. August Busch had his mother whisked back to the States. When she arrived by ship at Key West, she was detained by federal marshals for days, subjected to withering interrogation and a full-body cavity search upon the absurd suspicion she was carrying secret papers from the Kaiser, or for the Kaiser. Like other German Americans, August Busch felt it was necessary to proclaim publicly his pledge to sacrifice everything except loyalty to country and its honor to serve the government in bringing this war to a victorious conclusion. But the prohibitionists had their opportunity and pounced, denouncing the beer barons as subversives working for the enemy by stealing grains from the troops. Every bushel of grain that is destroyed making beer, editorialized the American issue, serves the Kaiser just as well as a bushel sunk by a submarine at sea. Woodrow Wilson ordered all breweries closed, and with the beer industry effectively muzzled, the 18th Amendment slipped through 36 legislatures, and national prohibition became law. Such are the affronts to liberty that can happen when campaigns of enforced loyalty are afoot. Hold on just a second. There's a lot of alliteration in this section that's hard for a dyslexic. Give me just a moment. Okay. So then it goes on to talk about how this sort of unhealthy view of loyalty escalated in World War II with the Japanese Americans. Such campaigns have proved disastrous for the concept of loyalty in America, tainting the legitimate demands of country and constitution. Such abuses have contributed to the modern notion that when at odds with friends or family or conscience, commitment to country comes last. Perhaps no abuse has done more discredit to the demands of love and loyalty to country than the decision by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the days after Pearl Harbor to lock up Japanese Americans in dusty desert detention camps. See what I'm saying about the alliteration? It's hard, people. Part of what made relocation centers so offensive was not just that they represented an assault on civil liberties of Americans. It was the implicit accusation that these Americans, because of their heritage, could not be trusted, the assumption that until proven otherwise, they were to be assumed disloyal. This, even though the Attorney General of California reported to Washington just after a couple months after Pearl Harbor. We have had no sabotage and no fifth column activity since the beginning of the war. What was the worst thing suffered by Japanese Americans in World War II? Was it the loss of their property as their abandoned farms and businesses were snatched up? Was it the loss of their freedom as they were herded into the stark confines of internment camps? Or was it the loss of a very basic sort of dignity, the degradation of being suspected of disloyalty? When the roundup began, Japanese American Citizens League told its members that going along with the relocation was the patriotic thing to do. You are not being accused of any crime. You are being removed only to protect you and because there might be one of you who might be dangerous to the U.S. The leader told them this in Issei at the behest of the federal government. It is your contribution to the war effort. You should be glad to be making sacrifice to prove your loyalty. The young men of Japanese descent would have been willing to make far greater sacrifices if their loyalty hadn't been questioned. In Hawaii, where the fear of fifth columnists might have been more likely, it was the site of Japan's attack on U.S. territory, and the islands had a much larger population of Japanese Americans than the mainland. There was no effort to quarantine the suspect group. 1 in 3 eligible Japanese American men in Hawaii signed up for military service. American recruiters got very different results when they went looking for volunteers at the internment camps. I can't imagine why. Only 1 in 14 young men joined to sign up. People will risk much if given their due as good citizens and true. Treat people as disloyal, put them under suspicion, and you end up, if not destroying loyalty, at least dampening the enthusiasm for it. There were outrageous and excessive reactions, and yet the prickly question of divided national loyalties remained. The Department of Defense continues to have an interest in figuring out whom it can trust not to spy and whom it should keep an eye on. Once upon a time, the biggest problems were either ideological, many of the Soviet Union's most helpful spies were Americans and Brits enthralled in the communist cause, or financial. The CIA was a bit slow to realize that Agent Aldrich Ames's salary couldn't sustain his habit of buying new Jaguar sedans. But now, it's the lingering extra-national ties of immigrants and their children that are proving to be the biggest security risk. Between the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War, loyalties divided by an allegiance to a home country other than the United States were the motive in fewer than 20% of espionage cases. But since 1990, according to a Department of Defense report, 57% of Americans caught up committing espionage were motivated by divided loyalties of that sort. During the post-war Red Scare of the late 40s, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. argued in the pages of the New York Times Magazine that liberal or even socialist views did not make one un-American. The only criterion for disloyalty, he wrote, is superior loyalty to another country. Though clearly, superior loyalty to another country can indeed be a problem, it isn't the only modern source of disloyalty. In the years just after World War II, there was a national fad for loyalty oaths, with demands that everyone from Hollywood stars to elementary school students profess their fidelity to the American way. In Indiana, you had to sign a loyalty oath to be allowed a career in professional wrestling. Hoping to outflank Republicans getting political mileage out of any anti-communism, President Harry Truman instituted by executive order a federal employees' loyalty and security program, meant to expose commies and subversives working in the federal government. It never amounted to much, perhaps because someone willing to be disloyal to his country isn't likely to hesitate when asked to sign a loyalty oath. This has long been recognized as a bit of a problem for the whole oath-taking business. John Lilburn, a revolutionary pamphleteer for the English Civil War, warned in 1647 that loyalty oaths are nothing but cloaks of knavery and breeders of strife and mischief. It's hard to argue with his observations that those who make nothing of an oath will break it whenever it suits their purpose. Whereas to him that conscientiously scruples an oath, his bare word is the sincerest tie to the world. And yet loyalty oaths have often been used, with greater or lesser success, usually lesser, for centuries. Critics of the loyalty programs in the 1940s and 50s complained that requiring people to take oaths of allegiance was inconsistent with the nation's founding principles. But loyalty oaths were commonplace as the approach of the Revolutionary War prompted a frenzy of oath-taking. Nor were their proofs of loyalty voluntary. George Washington was one of the most prominent advocates for public tests of loyalty. In 1775, he wrote, "It is high time a test act was prepared and every man called upon to declare himself, that we may distinguish friends from foes." Thomas Paine demanded loyalty oaths so that everyone could know, square by square and house by house, who was in real allegiance with the United Independent States and who are not. Let but the line be made clear and distinct, and all men will then know who they are to trust. The oaths that Washington pushed, and he pushed them not only for soldiers under his command, but also on civilians wherever his soldiers marched, were less about ensuring fidelity to the new nation than about forcing people to make a public break with any loyalty to Britain. The most common oaths started off by declaring Americans owe no allegiance or obedience to George III, King of Great Britain, and I renounce, refuse, and abjure any allegiance or obedience to him. It was a wedge Washington and his generals used aggressively, with the main effect being to reinforce the public sense that people were abandoning their ties to the king and the old country. Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were convinced that history and experience had proved that loyalty oaths were wonder workers in causes sacred and profane. Loyalty oaths may have worked wonders at making Tories feel abandoned by the fellow royalists they had expected to stand fast, but they didn't do anything to restrain traitors. In the summer of 1776, a Matahari in a Tory brothel convinced a customer named William Hickey, who was one of Washington's bodyguards, to hand his boss over to the British. The plot failed and Hickey hanged. Like the traitor Benedict Arnold a few years later, Hickey had duly signed the Continental Army's loyalty oath. And with the years leading to the Revolution, secessionists in the South used loyalty tests in the run-up to the Civil War as a way to force people to declare publicly that they had put their state, not the Union, first. Once the war was underway, though, it was Lincoln who made the most of loyalty tests. He offered them to rebel prisoners of war as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Southern civilians whose towns fell to Union troops had to swear an oath if they wanted to have access to food and other supplies. Lincoln demanded loyalty tests to be signed by all federal job seekers. Not surprisingly, rebel spies looking to infiltrate official Washington were more than happy to sign on the line. And then here he kind of goes back to the mention of Greek history again. The ancient Greeks were right to identify loyalty with trustworthiness, and you can't expect an honest answer from someone who is untrustworthy. No less a red hunter than Richard Nixon himself rejected the notion of loyalty oaths, arguing that they were worthless, that Alger Hiss would have signed one happily. As vice president, Nixon urged President Eisenhower to strip the war loyalty from all aspects of federal government security apparatus, to focus instead on who might be a risk, where riskiness was not just a matter of one's foreign connections but behaviors, such as homosexuality, that might leave one open to blackmail by foreign agents. They came up with Executive Order 10450, I guess it was called, which allowed the administration to give the boot to any federal employee whose behavior, activities, or associations tend to show that the individual is not reliable or trustworthy. It was a powerful club to wield, and Nixon would brag ahead of the 1954 midterm election that they had kicked thousands of communists and fellow travelers out of the government. In practice, it had the same fundamental flaw as loyalty oaths, a feebleness in the face of professional spycraft. Spooks worth their salt would simply avoid association and entanglements that might bring suspicion on them, just as the most hardcore of subversives could be expected to be the first in line to lavish the flag with kisses. The Supreme Court started to rein in the loyalty follies in the 1950s. Among the many loyalty oath rules in the United States was a California law requiring, in order to claim one's tax exemptions, a promise not to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. Probably a good rule. The Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional. In his concurring opinion, Justice Hugo Black echoed John Lilburn's argument about the hopeless inefficacy of such efforts. I am certain that loyalty to the United States can never be secured by the endless proliferation of loyalty oaths, he wrote. Loyalty must arise spontaneously from the hearts of people who love their country and respect their government. Such oaths have been seen as undermining loyalty by punishing honest criticism of the government's policies, which has made a very live issue out of an ancient question. Is patriotism a sustaining virtue or a destructive vice? Of all the loyalties that bind us, is commitment to country the most important, as Creon argued Antigone, or just the most dangerous? So there's something to think on there. So bringing things to a close here on this topic, I thought I would end on this closing paragraph in what chapter was this? I think it's the final chapter, actually, where he just gives sort of his rounding thoughts about how loyalty works in the world now. And he says, "Is there any room for anything so unironic in our glib, sarcastic, postmodern age? I hope so, for whatever the perils, whatever the pitfalls in which loyalty is prone, without it there is no real love or friendship. Loyalties, whether to people, to community, or to God, are essential in shaping and defining our identities. Allow loyalty to fall into disrepair and disrepute, and character crumbles along with it, both in the antique notion of character as an expression of virtue, as well as the less judgmental modern sense we have of character as just another word for personality. We are, as you could say, what we are loyal to. To identify loyalties is to shift and sort the core things we care about. Too few loyalties in our lives are shallow, thin, and unsatisfying, but too many loyalties and we end up with a cacophony of claims, a dissonance that leaves our lives more muddled than meaningful. We need to take loyalty seriously enough to find the right balance. We can make the bonds of loyalty stronger by taking seriously what it means to be a friend, expecting more of ourselves and others. We can be vigilant in avoiding the betrayal of friends, family, and country. We can do our best to sort out the potential conflicts among them long before their demands clash. And if that fails to avert catastrophe, we can recognize, as Agamemnon did not, that even a forced and unwilling act of disloyalty is a terrible harm. We should try to make amends if possible, and at the very least, grieve for the damage we've done. To be loyal is to be trustworthy. To be loyal is to keep your word. It's the simplest, most fundamental stuff of life. What good is love without loyalty? Who can be said to have lived a flourishing life who hasn't enjoyed the comforts of true friendship, which is to say, a loyal friendship? Who has faith without fidelity? Who can betray or be betrayed without being blighted? Who can walk the tightrope of life without the net of faithful family and friends? Loyalty may be a forgotten, forlorn relic, but as a frustrating and vexing virtue as it may be, it's time to dust it off and give it another try. Something to think on. If you have thoughts on this topic, feel free to share them below. What are some of your parameters for determining loyalty in somebody? Whether it's, a friend, family, coworker. Do you have certain things you look for where you have to have them in order to consider that person loyal to you and the friendship between you? Or are there things you look for that once it happens, there's no coming back from that, and that this relationship in whatever form it is, whether it's a coworker, friendship, romantic relationship, familial, whatever, are there things that you just cannot come back from and you have to cut ties with that person? What are some of those guidelines you have? Or if you want, you can just leave bitch sessions in the comments below. If there's something you want to rant about somebody that did you wrong, feel free to have a therapy session below and, tell me what you think. And we will talk soon. Bye, guys.